So now let's talk about what's going on the home front. How is this affecting everyday Americans and their lives while they were sitting at home? A group is formed during this time called the Office of War Information, and they're going to be in charge of imagery and messages during the war. So if you've ever seen those popular propaganda posters during this time, that was the Office of War Information. And they're going to try to appeal to patriotism and what Americans can do to support the war effort at home. So they're going to ask you to volunteer, to conserve your resources, to go on what we call rations. Don't talk to people if you've heard of military movement or plans from somebody you know that's in the war. Things like that are going to be the focus of the Office of War Information. So here's some examples of their propaganda posters. Do with less so they'll have enough. This had to do with rationing, where we limit the amount we get. So maybe every American family gets a dozen eggs every 2 weeks instead of getting as many eggs as you want, so that we have enough to send over to our troops, for example. This is an example of, this is what you would have a flag if you had somebody that had been killed in action or somebody that had been killed in the war. This is usually a flag you would hang for them. And this is the back of a Navy uniform, if it's hard for you to tell or if you've never seen one before. So the purpose of this propaganda poster was to say, you know, this could lead to American soldiers or sailors getting killed in the war because you talked to somebody that might have taken information back to maybe the Germans or Italians or Japanese. Other actions taken by Americans during this time are going to have a very high level of military enlistment. A lot of people that want to get involved. We're going to have buying of war bonds. That's where you basically give money to the government to help them pay for the war effort, and then you would later be paid back with interest after the war. So during World War II, 85 million Americans bought bonds, which brought $185 billion into the federal treasury. The war ended up costing $350 billion. And so you see how much, almost over half of the money that went to paying for the war came from these war bonds. And so it was a very successful program. And it just shows you that high level of volunteerism during the war. Also, we already talked about rationing. Victory gardens, I know for us in modern day, this seems like a neat concept. For those that lived in the 1940s, having a garden in your backyard wasn't that big of a deal. But a victory garden was a vegetable garden that you planted to make sure that there was adequate food supply for both troops and for civilians. So this really was helpful in rural and in urban neighborhoods where people could grow their own food, and that would leave food raised by farmers available for the government to ship to soldiers. So that was the whole idea of victory gardens. Not a revolutionary idea for those living in the 40s and 50s, but for those of us that don't have a garden in our backyard, that was kind of a big deal. Other things that are going to happen during the war are going to be opportunities and sometimes obstacles for women and minorities during this time. Women couldn't enlist in the regular armed forces, but they were part of the Army. One of the big things was called the Women's Army Corps, or WACS, and after basic training, they took clerical jobs in the military. In civilian part of the world, a lot of women, their big deal that you'll hear about is that they took over the jobs that were left by men who went off to fight in the war. And such as you had women that were shipbuilding and building airplanes, and so you had more than 6.5 million women enter the workforce during this time. Also, you had ethnic minorities that would fill the workplace and replace the men that went to the military. And you had also a lot of African Americans and Mexican Americans that served in the war. You had over 1 million African Americans serve in the military. You also had a large number of Mexican Americans. Unfortunately, for both of those groups, they still African Americans were segregated during the war, and then even had some issues with military benefits after the war. So there were still some hurdles to overcome during this time, but this really is going to help pave the way later for the civil rights movement, because we're going to see more African Americans are going to be seen more in an equal light with their contribution in the war, and then also women are going to be seen a little more equally, not completely equal, because of their role during the war. Another kind of scourge on our record during this time is going to be Japanese internment. And this is going to happen whenever the president's going to issue Executive Order 9066. So whenever you see 9066, that's going to be talking about permitting military to require Japanese Americans to relocate to these internment camps. And they mostly, if you ever see a map of internment camps, none of them are on the coast because they don't want it to be they didn't want it easy for Japanese Americans to get information back to their families. So anytime you see Executive Order 9066, that is talking about the issue of Japanese internment. So I know that you're hearing me say they went to these camps where they had to stay. Sounds a lot like concentration camps. And so we see this, and we see this is a huge constitutional issue and infringing on constitutional rights of Japanese Americans. And this wasn't necessarily people born in Japan that immigrated here. It was also people that were born in America that were just of Japanese descent. And this also happened to German and Italian Americans, not to a great extent as Japanese Americans, but there was a smaller number of German and Italian residents that were also in internment camps. A constitutional issue that's going to happen from this is going to be the court case of Korematsu versus the U.S. Korematsu is a Japanese American, and he believes his constitutional rights were being violated by this whole idea of Japanese internment. And the Supreme Court's actually going to upheld Executive Order 9066, saying that constitutional liberties can be limited in wartime. So they actually upheld internment in this court case. And then, of course, later they go back and they apologize and actually pay for compensation to the families because they did realize later on that that was kind of a big mistake. Presidents during wartime. Roosevelt, who became president during the Great Depression, is going to be president up until 1945, just before the end of the war. He does attempt to stay out of the war at the beginning and tries to stay neutral and isolationist before the attack on Pearl Harbor. We did send some money, and we did send a little bit of support financially and with supplies, but we didn't send troops until after we were officially, as a government, we didn't send troops until after we were attacked. And then he's also going to be responsible for this rapid mobilization of the war effort. Truman was vice president for only 82 days when President Roosevelt passed away. So his biggest legacy from World War II is his decision to give the go-ahead to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The atomic bomb was developed during World War II starting from the advice from Albert Einstein, where he warned Roosevelt that Germany had capabilities to build an atomic bomb. So Roosevelt gives the go-ahead to start a group in New Mexico to start creating an atomic bomb. They successfully tested in July of 1945, which doesn't help us in Europe because Germany had already surrendered by then. But of course, we were still fighting Japan at this time. And so Truman, they were getting ready to invade Japan, and he was worried that he was thinking there'd be close to 1 million American casualties just to invade Japan. And so he felt like dropping bombs on cities would lead to less overall casualties. So he picks 2 military production areas as targets, and that's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The result of the dropping of these 2 bombs is over 230,000 people are killed, and it does lead to Japan's surrendering shortly after these 2 bombs, and this ends the war for good. One of the biggest criticisms during this time was that there wasn't a need to even drop the bombs on populated areas, that they should have dropped them on an uninhabited island nearby as a scare tactic to scare them into surrendering instead of dropping them on populated areas. So this is still a very controversial topic even today, is why they decided to use the atomic bomb. How this era might be assessed. Let's look at this question. Sometimes I like to give you a question with a headline and see what you do with it. So if I get a headline, obviously I want to read it. It's pretty important. I want to make sure I know the date. We know 1942 is after the U.S. enters the war, and Japanese forces occupied Bataan Peninsula. So let's look at our question. Many of the U.S. soldiers involved in the event mentioned in this headline. So the event mentioned, talking about Bataan, and the only thing I know from that is the Bataan Death March. And I know from the Bataan Death March, a bunch of soldiers got killed or died from diseases and from this brutal 60-mile march. So let's look at my answer choices. What did Did they remain in trenches and resist Japanese invasion? Were they exchanged for Japanese prisoners of war? Were they escaped and were redeployed to the European theater, or did they die during a forced march to a prison camp in the Philippines? Well, I see death march, so that kind of helps me there. The Bataan when Japan occupied the Bataan Peninsula, we surrendered right away. We didn't remain, and there was no Japanese prisoners to exchange. And sometimes you'll see answer choices that don't really make sense, like sending all these troops that are in the Philippines all the way over to Europe. That doesn't make sense, so it's probably not the right answer. But we know from paying attention in class, the Bataan Death March came from this, which is that forced march. Now we have a question with a quote, and again, when I have a quote, I want to know who said it, and I want to know the year. So I know that President Roosevelt, he's president during this time, and I know that this is just before World War II. So let's look at our question and then we'll read our quote. What was the ultimate result of the situation President Roosevelt refers to in this excerpt? So we want to know what happened after the incident or the situation he talks about in the quote. So we want to know, what is the situation? The conflict is still sharpening throughout the world between two political systems. The one system represents government by freedom of choice exercised by the individual citizens, and the other, an opposing system, individual freedom and initiative are all made subordinate to the totalitarian state. Well, totalitarian, I remember that word had to do with dictators, because we talked about totalitarian dictators in my U.S. history class. So one group allows individual freedom, and the other group is going to make all freedom subordinate, or where they have to obey these dictators in this totalitarian state. And we know this is right before World War II, so we want to keep that in mind, because even if I know my year, that's going to help me out. Did it lead to a surge of social unrest in South America? Now remember, if we haven't talked about South America, then it's probably not going to be the right answer. If it's completely out of left field and you haven't heard of it, that's not the right answer. The outbreak of World War II, well, we know World War II is 1939 to 1945, and this was said the year before, so that's entirely possible. A shift in favor of the policy of appeasement, so letting them do what they want, and this is just untrue, and that's not what they're talking about in the quote. Or is it talking about the overthrow of the monarchy in Russia? This happened, and again, if you know your time periods, this happened in 1917, which is not near 1938. So the only logical answer you have in this one is the outbreak of World War II.